Hi guys. One of the things I firmly believe is that everyone has a story, and I also believe that no matter who you are, your story is important and it's powerful. And it's important and powerful because it shapes your identity. It's a record of the processes of what made you who you are now, and it provides kind of like the framework, the context to understand nearly everything about you. And that's the power of stories. And it's not just your story telling you who you are, but other people, they kind of want to share with you their story in hopes of shaping you, of molding you, forming you. And it's not just other people, there's bigger stories out there. And some of those bigger stories are stories of our culture, of our nation, our government, our workplaces, the stories marketing companies tell us, and of course, the stories of our families. Now, some of these stories are helpful and others less so, but they all want to shape you. They all want to form you. They want to influence you. And amongst those bigger stories, I think that God has a story. And I think that God's story tells us who we're actually meant to be. God's story wants to shape us into who we are designed to be. And you might think, oh yeah, God's story is about following rules and going to church on Sunday. And actually, maybe God's story might surprise you because I don't think it is about those things. God's story, I believe, is actually the story of us as humans. God's story is the story of our true identity. And there's a part in the New Testament that it's from the book of the Bible, 1 Peter, chapter 2, verse 9, and it says this. And it kind of identifies us. It's the story that God says about our identity. And it says this: "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." Now, there's a few things in this verse, a few kind of facets about our identity, and they're all encouraging, all of them. But I want to focus on the idea of being a priest or a royal priesthood, being priestly. Now, being priestly, it's not just a job title for priests. I mean, it is that, but it's more. I think being priestly is meant to be part of everyone's story. I think being priestly is actually central to the story of humanity, the story of us. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be priestly? Well, let me read to you from the Hebrew Torah and the book of Numbers. And it's a story that seems a bit strange. And it seems a bit strange because it's actually very strange. And I think this strange story tells us something about who we are in our priestly identity. And so let me read it to you. Numbers 25, verse 6, and says this: "Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman, right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped. But those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, 'Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am, and I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites.'" So this is a strange story. Israel has been freed from slavery and it's kind of traveling on its way into its promised land. And the reason why it was freed is because God had chosen them to be a nation of priests to bless the whole world, stamped with the name of God. The nation of Israel was to bear his name and represent him and his heart to the nations, his heart to be a blessing to the nations. And what's taking place at the beginning of Numbers 25 is that the men of Israel, not all of them, but a lot of them, were engaging in sexual activity with the Moabites and the Midianites. And you go, oh, well, maybe that's not the best thing to do, but is it really that big a deal? Well, the kind of sexual activity that they were taking part of is ritualized sexual activity. It's temple prostitution. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So that's what's going on. And as a result of that kind of rebellion against God, a plague had broken out. And basically, Israel was set free from their captivity to be a blessing to the nations, but instead of being a blessing, they were drawn into the same damaging practices of the nations. Israel was meant to be a blessing to the Moabites and the Midianites, but they were drawn into the same kind of corruption that they were doing. And the Midianites and the Moabites, they're literally the half brothers of Israel. They're descending from Abraham's nephew and son. So there's a relationship going on here, and this ritualized sexual behavior and the deep injustice that the Israelites were partaking in led to this plague affecting the Israelites. And this passage is confronting. I don't know if you find it confronting, but I definitely find it confronting because it shows God responding to an act of zeal by a priest, by offering him a covenant. This act of zeal actually was an act of violence. And so we want to look today at how maybe we can be zealous, but maybe we can be zealous in a way that's contextualized for today. This idea of, as priests, we're meant to be zealous, but as priests, we're meant to have contextualized zeal. So that's what we're looking at, that part of our priestly identity. So Numbers 25, back to Numbers 25, verse 6, it says this: Then an Israelite man brought into the camp. So in the context of all these Israelite men, they were going out of the camp to have ritualized sex with the Midianite and Moabite women. And then an Israelite man, he brings into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel. So I'm not sure if you remember, but earlier in our priestly kind of studies, looking at this idea of the story of us, the priestly story of us, we saw how Aaron, the grandfather of Phinehas, stepped into a public health situation where there was another plague taking place, stood between the living and the dead, and brought life, and saw the plague was able to stop. Now it's the turn of his grandson, Phinehas. He's doing the same. He's taking the necessary action to stop the plague. So what was happening was that, this ritualized sex with Midianite and Moabite priestesses, and it was an act of worship practiced to gain economic prosperity and favor from their gods, the Baals. And so, rather than worshiping God, the Israelite men thought, I'm going to worship Baal, and to do that, I'm going to engage in ritualized sex with the priestess of Baal. So the Midianites and the Moabites, they kind of had fallen into a trap, and they drew the men of Israel into that trap as well. The Midianites and the Moabites, they were trying to manipulate their gods and goddesses through ritualized sex. If we want to do these things so that we can get things from these prosperity gods, these fertility gods, these gods of agriculture and farm produce. And so they fall into the trap of trying to manipulate their gods and goddesses, but the trap that they fell into is that they were being manipulated and enslaved by these gods, false gods. Men would use the priestesses as a means to get something else. The act of sex, rather than being one of love, was an act of manipulation of a deity to get what they wanted. So Israel, instead of blessing the nations, which is what they were called to and what they are set free from slavery for, instead of being a blessing to Moab and Midianites, they engage in the same ritualized sexual behavior with Moab and with Midian, becoming like them, using them, and you could argue abusing them. From blessing the nations to using the nations. And a plague broke out because they had moved so far away from their identity. Now, Numbers 25 verse 12 says, therefore, this is God speaking, therefore tell him, Phinehas, I am making my covenant of peace with him. Verse 12, then jumping to verse 13, because he was zealous for the honor of his God. So, for me, this is a confronting passage because someone brought a ritual prostitute into the Israelite camp. They were brazen, they were bold, and one of the priests, Phinehas, goes and kills them both. And so that's pretty full on and confronting in of itself. But what's even kind of more shocking is God's response. God responds to Phinehas's violent act by setting up a covenant with him. I will make a covenant with him, covenant of peace, a covenant of shalom, a covenant of fullness, of prosperity, of security, of relational flourishing. And there's a few ways we could interpret what's going on here. And I think it would be quite misguided to interpret God as someone who is celebrating acts of violence, or God who is happy that interracial relationships aren't taking place. I think that would be completely the wrong interpretation. Instead, I kind of want to interpret this act through who I believe is the archetypal priest, the true priest, which is Jesus. So instead I want to look ahead to Jesus' display of zeal. You could even say Jesus' display of anger in the temple. And we're going to read this shortly, but it's from John chapter 2. And I think if you look ahead to Jesus' display of zeal, Jesus' display of anger, it reveals what God is really concerned about. God's not necessarily concerned about interracial relations, or he's not really concerned about this idea of celebrating violence. He's not celebrating that. What is actually taking place, I think, is interpreted through what Jesus does in the temple. And in that story, Jesus goes to where the money changers are, and they are in the outer courts of the temple. The outer courts was also called the court of the Gentiles. It's where the nations, the people who didn't know God, they could come to the outer courts. They weren't allowed inside the inner courts. They were allowed in the outer courts, the courts of the nations. And instead of being able to come into the outer courts to learn about God, the religious people of Jesus' day had set up business inside the outer courts, displacing the opportunity for the nations to learn about God. And Jesus wasn't happy with that. Jesus went in and he overturned the money changers' tables because they had hijacked God's true heart, which is where I want the nations to be blessed. That was always God's intention. In choosing Israel, it wasn't just about Israel, it was also about the nations. And so what happened in Jesus' day was that the intention to bless a nation was hijacked, and instead it was what was intended to bless was instead hijacked to use and abuse the nations. And I think that's what's happening here in Numbers 25. Israel is using and abusing the nations, and God is happy that that's being put a stop to. So I think actually we are meant to be zealous. We are meant to be zealous like Phinehas. We are meant to be zealous like Jesus. Not for rules, not for determining who's in and who's out, who's good and who's bad, who belongs and who doesn't. But I think we're meant to be zealous, passionate for God's heart and for God's mission. And the things that makes God upset should make us upset. But I think what makes God upset the most is when his mission is hijacked for the selfish needs of human beings. I really believe part of our identity is we're meant to be passionate. We're not meant to be apathetic. A lack of passion has led to all sorts of problems. I think that we're called to be a blessing. We're called to carry his image. We're called to fix what is broken and bring in his new creation. And we're meant to care about that. And we're meant to be passionate about that. And we're meant to be zealous for that. And I think we're meant to be zealous in a contextualized way. Obviously, we're not going to pick up a spear and do anything with it in this day and age. But I think a contextualized zeal is something we are meant to have. I think that's part of our priestly identity. John 2 verse 17 says this. This is after Jesus had turned over the money changers' tables in the outer courts, the courts of the Gentiles. And his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal, there's that word again, zeal for your house will consume me. So I think looking at our perfect priestly example, Phinehas is a good example, but our perfect priestly example is Jesus. Jesus is identified as zealous for God's house. And Jesus, instead of taking up a spear and ending a rebellion as Phinehas did, Jesus took a spear into his side, into himself, and he laid down his life on behalf of our brokenness. Jesus' zeal, contextualized for our time and our age, Jesus' zeal is meant he sacrificially served. And I think that's what contextualized zeal looks like now. It's like this idea of, I care so much about God's plan to fix what's been broken, I will pay the price that needs to be paid. Whatever it costs me. Maybe it costs me my life. I'm going to pay that price so that others can live. I mean, that's what the true priest did. Jesus. Rather than picking up a spear was thrust into him. But those are just my thoughts, and I'll be interested in hearing some of yours. I've got some questions here, and hopefully they kick off a bit of discussion. So let's see how you go. First question is, the story of Phineas is confronting, right? I think you would agree with that, or maybe you don't, which is fine. But what stands out to you in that passage? What confuses you or troubles you or challenges you? And why do you think God responds the way he did to Phineas's action? What does that tell us about zeal and God's honor? What's that connection? What dangers do you see if someone today interpreted zeal in the wrong way? How can we get off? How can we go wrong? Get off track on this idea of zeal? And remember, I think we have to have the correctly contextualized zeal. Another question: how does Jesus' example of zeal, taking the spear into himself, into his side, instead of using it on someone else, how does that reshape our understanding of passion for God? Now, what does contextualized zeal, like Jesus's, look like in our world today? Hopefully not many of us are called to take a spear into our side. I hope that that's not what it looks like for us. But can you think of examples of people or communities living that out? What would that look like today for us? And where in your own life do you feel called to show more passion or more zeal for God's mission? I think we're meant to have that. We're definitely not meant to be apathetic. And so that's it for me, guys. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.